He just wanted to check out the old island his grandpa left behind. He went there with his son and dog in the winter, surrounded by ice and fog. But in the attic of an abandoned house, they found some letters and learned why his grandpa never sold the land, even though he died poor. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road to the north narrowed into a single line of frozen gravel bordered by skeletal trees. The wind pressed against the windshield, pushing flakes of snow in long, white streaks that looked like threads unraveling across the air. Inside the car, silence filled the space between father and son, like a third presence. Dense, cold, and almost physical. Mark Ellis kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the leather. Beside him, his 11-year-old son, Lucas, sat with his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the blurred shape of the forest beyond the glass. In the back seat, the black German shepherd, Storm, shifted occasionally, letting out a quiet sigh each time the car hit a patch of rough ice. Mark had not planned for this journey. It had been forced upon him the way certain moments in life come uninvited and yet refuse to be ignored. 3 weeks earlier, a letter had arrived at his apartment, its paper thick and old-fashioned, bearing the seal of a notary firm in the town of Brighton's Cove. The message inside was short and formal. His grandfather, Severin Ellis, long presumed dead or forgotten by the family, had left behind a small island on a northern lake and had named Mark his heir. The rest was legal phrasing and coordinates, but those words, left behind a small island, had lodged themselves in his mind and refused to leave. It wasn't hope that brought him here. It was the quiet exhaustion of a man who no longer believed in starting over, but couldn't stand still either. Since the accident that had taken his wife 2 years ago, Mark had lived by habit, not conviction. He worked small repair jobs when he could, fixed radios and fences for neighbors, kept the apartment as clean as a hospital room. Lucas went to school, came home, and spent evenings on the couch with the dog. Their conversations had shrunk to single-word exchanges. Homework. Dinner. Bed. The kind of dialogue that keeps people alive but doesn't let them live. Now the road before them stretched into white oblivion. The GPS had lost signal hours ago, and the map on the dashboard was stained with coffee and creased from overuse. Mark slowed the car and glanced at the frozen expanse beyond the trees. Somewhere out there lay the lake half ice, half water, and beyond it, an island that had belonged to a man he barely remembered. When the car finally reached the shore, daylight was already fading. The wind smelled of iron and pine resin. The remnants of an old dock stuck out from the snow like ribs. Storm jumped out first, landing softly on the powdery crust and sniffing the air with a low growl. Lucas followed, clutching the straps of his backpack. His breath rose in thin plumes. "Is this it?" he asked quietly. Mark nodded. "That's the lake." His voice sounded strange to him, hoarse and uncertain. The lake was not entirely frozen. Sheets of ice extended from the shore, but farther out, the surface broke into patches of dark, moving water. The distance to the island looked short, maybe 200 meters, but the wind made it treacherous. Near the dock lay an overturned wooden boat, its hull cracked but still solid enough to float. Mark ran his hand along the frozen edge, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath the ice. It smelled faintly of tar and old smoke. They spent an hour repairing the gaps with boards, scavenged from a nearby shed. Lucas held the nails while Mark hammered, his gloves stiff with cold. The boy didn't complain, just kept glancing toward the horizon, where the faint outline of the island was barely visible through the drifting snow. Storm paced in circles, occasionally barking into the emptiness. When the boat was ready, they loaded their few belongings, sleeping bags, a small stove, a sack of canned food, and a folded tarp. Mark pushed the boat into the water, feeling the chill bite through his gloves as he steadied it against the ice. Lucas climbed in, and Storm leapt after him, settling at the bow like a silent guardian. Mark gave one last look to the land behind them, the world they were leaving, and then pushed off. The oars creaked. Ice cracked under the hull. Each stroke carried them deeper into the lake's heart, where the air grew sharper and the silence heavier. Above them, the sky was a low dome of pewter, and somewhere behind the clouds, the sun sank without warmth. Halfway across, the boat struck a hidden sheet of ice and tilted sharply. Lucas gasped, grabbing the side. Storm's claws scraped the wood, but the dog stayed still, eyes fixed forward. Mark steadied the boat, breathing hard, waiting for the balance to return. When it did, he resumed rowing slowly, rhythmically, until the black shape of the island loomed close enough to touch. They reached shore, just as the last light faded. The island smelled of damp moss and pine needles, and the wind carried the faint echo of waves breaking against the rocks. A narrow path led upward from the dock to a clearing. At its center stood the house. It was smaller than Mark had imagined, a single-story cabin with a sagging roof and a chimney leaning slightly to one side. The windows were broken, their frames furred with frost. Through the open doorway he could see the skeleton of old furniture and a rusted stove. Mark stepped inside first. The air was dry and thick with dust, as if time itself had sealed the room. He struck a match and lit the old kerosene lantern he'd brought from the car. The yellow light spread across the walls, revealing faded wallpaper and a collection of tools hanging on nails. A hammer, a wrench, a wood plane, all covered in rust. He found the fireplace beneath a pile of debris and cleared it. Lucas fetched logs from outside, while Storm circled the room, sniffing every corner. When the fire finally caught, its warmth felt almost foreign, like something borrowed from another life. They sat close to it, thawing their hands. Dinner was simple. Canned beans, mixed with slices of bacon heated in a dented pan, bread that had gone hard during the trip, and tea poured from the thermos. The boy ate quietly, feeding small pieces to the dog. The firelight made their shadows dance on the walls, and for the first time in months, Mark felt something other than fatigue, something like a beginning. After they ate, Mark climbed the narrow ladder to the attic. The boards creaked under his weight. The lantern's light swept across a space filled with dust and cobwebs. In one corner stood a wooden chest, bound by metal hinges. It took effort to pry it open, and when he did, the scent of aged paper rose like breath from the past. Inside were rolled sheets of parchment, bound letters, and notebooks filled with faded ink. The handwriting was firm but old, signed each time with the initials S.E. He sat on the floor and opened one of the notebooks. The first page bore a line written in careful strokes: "To build a home that can withstand any storm, not only of sea, but of life." Mark read it twice, the words sinking into him with a strange gravity. He imagined Severin, the grandfather he'd never met, sitting at a desk in this same room decades ago, drawing lines across paper, dreaming of something that could survive the weather of the world. When the lantern began to dim, he closed the chest and descended. Lucas was already asleep, curled up near the fire with Storm at his side. The dog lifted its head briefly, eyes glinting in the half-light, then rested again. Mark added another log to the fire and sat watching the flames. The wind outside had grown louder, brushing against the walls like a restless spirit, but the house held firm. He thought of the city they had left behind, the noise, the bills, the faces that looked away when he passed. Here there was none of that, only the sound of crackling wood and the steady breathing of his son and the dog. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to check his phone, to think of what came next. There was only this moment, the warmth of the fire, the faint scent of salt and pine, and the promise of the letters upstairs waiting to be read. Before lying down, he opened the door slightly and looked outside. The lake stretched in silence under a sky of broken stars. In the distance, he could still see the faint shimmer of the mainland, but it already seemed like another world. Snow began to fall slowly, softly, in flakes so fine they seemed to float rather than fall. Mark watched them gather on the frozen edge of the dock, then turned back inside. He lay down on the floor beside his son. Storm shifted closer, pressing against his side. The fire flickered lower, the shadows deepened, and Mark let his eyes close. In the quiet before sleep, he thought of the words he had read upstairs, about storms, about homes, about the strength to endure. He didn't yet know why his grandfather had built this house, or why he had left it to him. But as the wind brushed against the roof and the lake groaned beneath its thin ice, Mark felt something stir in him, a sense that the journey wasn't about inheritance at all. It was about learning how to withstand his own storms. Outside, the snow kept falling. The lake slowly froze over, sealing them in for the night, and the island, forgotten by the world, breathed quietly under its white veil, waiting for the morning that would begin everything again. Morning came quietly, as if the island itself were reluctant to wake. The fire in the hearth had gone out sometime in the night, and the air was cold enough that Mark could see his breath. He stirred, careful not to wake Lucas, who slept with an arm thrown across the dog. Outside, faint light filtered through the cracks in the boarded windows. The wind had stilled, and from somewhere far across the frozen lake came the hollow sound of ice shifting. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the chest, both peaceful and heavy. Mark got up, fed the last of the dry logs into the fireplace, and struck a match. When the flame caught, it illuminated the room in soft amber, revealing just how much work lay ahead. Dust, rot, and the memory of abandonment clung to every surface. But in that same decay, there was promise, something to be reclaimed. They began their days by building rhythm. After breakfast oatmeal, with a handful of dried berries and a pinch of salt, they worked in short bursts, warming their hands by the fire between tasks. Mark started by patching the broken windows with planks scavenged from the shed near the dock. Lucas gathered branches and sorted them into piles of kindling. Storm followed them constantly, nosing into snowbanks, shaking his fur free of frost. The boy laughed the first time the dog disappeared into a drift and emerged coated white from snout to tail. It was a small sound, barely there, but to Mark it felt like sunlight breaking through overcast sky. In the afternoons, they cleared the roof of snow and repaired the beams where rot had set in. The tools they found in the house were old, but sturdy saws and hammers with handles worn smooth by long use. Mark traced the carved initials S.E. burned into one of the handles and realized these had belonged to Severin. He imagined his grandfather's hands gripping the same tools decades earlier, shaping the house they were now trying to save. It was strange, the way time folded like that, how one man's unfinished work could become another's redemption. Food became their anchor. Each meal marked the rhythm of survival. By midday, when their breath fogged the air and their fingers stiffened from cold, they would gather by the fire and eat something hot. Lucas learned to clean fish under the ice, his small hands red from the freezing water, but steady with concentration. Together, they made soup pieces of perch, diced potatoes, a chopped onion, and salt. Sometimes they'd mix in a handful of rice or a scrap of dried bacon. The smell filled the small room and softened its edges. In those moments, even silence felt companionable. At night, when the wind rose and howled through the chimney, Mark would climb to the attic to read Severin's letters by lamplight. The handwriting was firm, deliberate, and carried the rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime measuring things. Angles, lines, storms. One letter spoke of the philosophy behind his craft. A house, like a ship, must not resist the wind. It must listen to it. Strength is not defiance, but balance. Another contained sketches of curved supports and adjustable joints, designs made to move with the pressure of storms instead of against them. The man had built not just walls, but an idea. Resilience through acceptance. Mark found himself reading those words long after the flame had burned low, feeling that his grandfather had written them for him, even if neither of them had known it. Days turned into weeks. The island, once foreign, began to feel like a living thing, moody, unpredictable, but honest. Lucas adapted quickly. He woke early without complaint, tied the dog's leash, and followed Mark outside before sunrise. They fetched water from the lake through a hole in the ice, hauled firewood, and reinforced the outer walls with new planks. At night, they collapsed beside the fire, too tired to speak. And yet, something wordless passed between them, an understanding that didn't need explanation. Storm slept between them, head resting on Lucas's leg. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west. The temperature dropped so fast that the air seemed to freeze mid-breath. The sky turned to steel, and the first flakes of snow came sideways. Mark secured the shutters while Lucas and Storm brought in the tools. The wind hit hard, shaking the house until the nails creaked. For hours, it raged, slamming against the walls, tearing branches from trees. Mark felt the weight of every gust in his chest. The house shuddered but held. It wasn't defiance. It was something subtler, as though the walls flexed with the wind, bending but not breaking. When it was finally over, the island lay blanketed in a smooth layer of snow that shimmered blue under the dawn light. Lucas was the first to step outside. He stood in the stillness and whispered, "It's like we're the only ones left in the world." Mark didn't disagree. The storm had damaged the shed, splitting one of its supports. They rebuilt it together, father teaching son how to notch the beams and drive the pegs. Lucas's hands, once soft and uncertain, began to carry the rough confidence of someone learning to shape wood. Storm stayed close, tail sweeping the snow, as if overseeing their work. They repaired the roof, sealed cracks, and when the sun dipped low, returned to the cabin where the fire waited. That evening, they ate fish, fried on a skillet over open flame, the smell of oil and wood smoke filling the air. Mark poured tea from their dented kettle, and they drank in silence, both staring into the flames. That night, while Lucas slept, Mark read another of Severin's letters. This one was different, less about structures, more about life. To build something lasting, one must first make peace with loss. A house can stand against weather, but a man must learn to bend with time. He read it twice, feeling a slow ache rise within him. The words hit a nerve he had long ignored. For months, he had carried the weight of his wife's death like an anchor, too heavy to let go, too familiar to release. But here, surrounded by ice and wood and the quiet persistence of the island, that grief began to loosen its grip. He didn't forget. He simply stopped resisting. When Lucas found a fragment of an old model ship near the edge of the clearing a few days later, Mark took it as a sign. The boy brought it in, his face flushed from the cold. It was only the hull, cracked and half-buried in moss, but the initials S.E. were carved into the wood. They placed it on the mantelpiece above the fire. That night, they sat long after the embers dimmed, watching the small shape glow orange in the fading light. Winter deepened. Some mornings, the lake was so still that the horizon disappeared entirely, sky and ice merging into one. On those days, Mark felt a rare calm. They had enough food to last, enough firewood stacked by the wall. Lucas seemed stronger, his cheeks red from cold, his laughter louder. Even Storm, once restless, now lay for hours at the doorway, head resting on his paws, content to watch the snow drift down. Then came another challenge. A heavy wind tore down part of the outer wall one evening, and the temperature plunged dangerously low. They worked through the night to rebuild it, using the last of the nails and spare boards. Mark slipped once, cutting his palm on a jagged plank. Blood darkened the snow, but he wrapped it in cloth and kept going. Lucas fetched the lanterns and refused to go inside until the job was done. When it was over, they sat by the fire, hands raw, eyes half closed from exhaustion. "It's holding," Lucas murmured, and Mark smiled. "Yes," he said quietly, "it's holding." By late winter, the house no longer looked abandoned. The roof gleamed with a new layer of tar and cedar. The windows were sealed with thick panes, and the walls no longer groaned when the wind blew. Inside, the air smelled of pine sap and bread. Mark had found an old iron pan and taught Lucas to bake simple loaves over coals. The crackling crust filled the house with warmth that no fire alone could make. Meals became moments of celebration. Bread, fish, stew, sometimes potatoes, fried golden in oil. Evenings ended with tea, sweetened by honey they'd brought from the mainland. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Something in Mark began to shift. The routine that had once been mere survival turned into purpose. He found meaning in small actions, tightening a bolt, smoothing a beam, teaching Lucas how to cut straight with a saw. He realized that building the house was building themselves again, plank by plank. Sometimes he caught himself talking aloud to Severin, as if the old man were still there, guiding him through the work. Perhaps, in some way, he was. The snow outside glowed faintly under moonlight. The wind brushed through the trees, carrying a low, rhythmic whisper. Lying awake, Mark listened and realized it sounded almost like breathing. The house, with all its creaks and sighs, had come alive. It was no longer a relic of someone else's dream. It was theirs now. He turned toward Lucas, sleeping peacefully beside the dog, and felt something close to peace for the first time in years. When morning came, he opened the door to a sky washed clean of clouds. The island sparkled, covered in frost that caught the light like glass. The air smelled faintly of thaw. Far off under the ice, water moved. Mark stepped outside, his boots crunching softly in the snow, and looked back at the house. Its roof caught the sun, and a thin thread of smoke curled from the chimney. He thought of Severin's words, the house that breathes, the strength that bends, and understood them fully now. Strength wasn't about standing tall through every storm. It was about yielding just enough to endure. He turned to see Lucas standing behind him, the dog at his side, their faces still drowsy from sleep. "It's getting warmer," Lucas said. Mark nodded. "Yes, the ice won't last forever." They stood for a moment in silence, the wind tugging at their sleeves. Somewhere beneath the frozen surface of the lake, spring was beginning its slow work. The season of storms was ending, but another kind of test was waiting. One that would not come from weather, but from choice. Mark didn't know it yet, but the calm ahead would ask more of him than any winter had. For now, he only breathed in the cold air, felt the house behind him solid and steady, and allowed himself to believe that they had finally learned how to live with the wind instead of against it. By the time spring reached the island, it came not with sudden bloom, but with quiet persistence. The snow melted in thin veins along the path, trickling into the ground like spilled mercury. Days grew longer, and the ice on the lake began to crack apart in slow, echoing sighs. Mark stood one morning by the shore, hands in his pockets, watching as the first dark ribbons of water stretched between the ice floes. The air smelled of thawing wood and wet moss. Behind him, the house stood firm, its roof catching the sunlight, the repaired boards gleaming with fresh tar. Smoke curled from the chimney. Lucas was making breakfast. The boy had learned to wake before his father now, feeding the fire, boiling water, calling softly for the dog. The rhythm of their days had changed. What had begun as survival had become a kind of life, simple but grounded, built from repetition and quiet endurance. Storm ran ahead along the edge of the clearing, barking at something invisible, tail sweeping through the air. The sound of his paws splashing through puddles mingled with the creak of the trees. Mark smiled faintly, his gaze drifting toward the boat tethered to the dock. It rested half on the ice, half in water, waiting. The sight filled him with both comfort and unease. Soon the lake would be clear again, and the island would no longer be cut off from the rest of the world. He wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a warning. That morning, they ate fish stew left from the night before, cold, but rich with flavor. Lucas added small pieces of bread to the bowl and fed the dog what remained. After breakfast, they worked outside. Together, they cleared branches from the roof, repaired the fence near the dock, and painted the shutters in the color Mark found among Severin's old supplies, a deep pine green that blended with the forest. The boy hummed while he worked, a habit he had picked up during winter. Mark listened to it with quiet satisfaction. The house that had once been silent now echoed with sound hammering, laughter, the shuffle of boots, and the low bark of a dog. The island felt alive again, as if awakening with them. In the evenings, they sat on the steps of the porch, watching the last sheets of ice drift away. The air grew softer. Birds returned, first a few, then in flocks, filling the sky with motion. Mark sometimes caught himself thinking that maybe this could be permanent. Maybe they didn't need to return to the city, with its gray streets and restless noise. Here, there was clarity. Here, he knew what each day demanded, and that was enough. But the world beyond the island had not forgotten them. One afternoon, while Lucas and Storm were down by the shore trying to catch minnows with a makeshift net, Mark heard a sound that didn't belong, the distant hum of an engine cutting through the stillness. He stepped out of the workshop, wiping sawdust from his hands, and saw a white motorboat approaching across the water. It was new, sleek, out of place among the weathered wood and moss. As it drew closer, he recognized the man standing at the bow. Tall, well-dressed, wearing a long gray coat and leather gloves. Even from a distance, Mark could see the confidence of someone used to ownership. The name came to him before the face Harris. He remembered the letters among Severin's papers, the legal notices and land offers from the company Harris once represented. Severin had refused them all. Now, decades later, the man, or perhaps his successor, had come back. Mark met him at the dock. Harris stepped ashore without hesitation, his polished boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. He extended a gloved hand that Mark ignored. "Mr. Ellis," Harris said, with the calm assurance of someone used to dictating the terms of conversation. "I see you've made improvements." His gaze traveled from the repaired fence to the house in the distance. "It's remarkable what you've done here." Mark said nothing, his shoulders squared. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of pine and thawed soil. Harris adjusted his coat. "I'll be direct," he continued. "My company has been interested in this property for a long time. We're developing the northern coast lodges, marinas, private retreats. Your grandfather resisted change, but I suspect you're a more practical man." He handed Mark a crisp folder. Inside was an offer numbers, printed in neat black ink, the kind that could erase debt, rebuild lives, buy comfort. Harris's tone softened, as if rehearsed. You could start fresh. You and your boy. Sell this place, and you'll never have to worry again. Mark closed the folder without looking further. The paper felt heavy in his hands. Unreal. He thought of Lucas running barefoot in the grass that now grew near the fence, of Storm sleeping by the door, of the nights spent rebuilding the house beam by beam. This island had cost him blisters, pain, and fear, but it had also given him something money never could. Peace. He glanced at Harris, whose polished calm seemed suddenly hollow. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Harris nodded, satisfied, and left the folder on the dock. "I'll return in a week," he said, before stepping back into his boat. That night, Mark barely slept. The rain began before midnight, soft at first, then heavy, drumming against the roof. He sat by the window, watching the water run down the glass, the glow of the dying fire flickering behind him. The folder lay on the table, unopened. Lucas stirred in his sleep, the dog curled beside him. For hours, Mark listened to the storm build. The wind howled across the lake, the same sound that had haunted the island all winter. But now it felt different. Less like a threat, more like a question. When dawn came, the storm turned violent. Rain lashed the windows, and waves slammed against the dock, sending spray high into the air. The roof groaned, and the chimney whistled under the wind's pressure. Mark threw on his coat and stepped outside. The cold hit like a slap. The world was a blur of gray water and flying leaves. The house trembled, but held. He ran along the side, checking the reinforcements they had built during winter. The beams bent, but didn't crack. The new roof panels flexed with each gust, but stayed in place. For a moment, standing there in the chaos, he understood exactly what Severin had meant in his letters. The house did not fight the storm. It breathed with it. Inside, Lucas was awake, pale, but calm. Together they secured the shutters and brought the dog away from the door. The hours that followed were endless, a battle of patience and endurance. Each creak of wood felt like the heartbeat of the island itself. By late afternoon, the wind began to weaken, the rain turning into a soft drizzle. The world outside shimmered under a pale, washed-out light. The house had survived. They ate their meal in silence that evening, simple fried fish and bread. The table shook slightly each time the wind brushed the walls, but neither of them minded. Mark poured tea into 2 metal cups and handed one to Lucas. The boy's face glowed in the firelight, his eyes steady. "The storm didn't win," he said quietly. Mark smiled. "No, it never does if you listen to it." That night, after Lucas and Storm had fallen asleep, Mark returned to the table where the folder still lay. The papers inside were slightly damp at the edges. He read through the pages slowly, the numbers blurring before his eyes. It wasn't the money that bothered him. It was what it represented, a return to the world that measured value in digits and property, not in work and time. He thought of Severin, alone on this island, refusing to sell. Maybe the old man hadn't been stubborn. Maybe he'd understood something deeper. That some places are not meant to be owned. They are meant to be kept alive. In the morning, the air smelled of renewal. Mist rose from the lake, and thin rays of sunlight touched the wet ground. Mark walked to the dock, where Harris had left his offer. He held the papers for a moment, then tore them slowly into pieces and let the wind take them. The fragments scattered across the water, drifting toward the melting ice. The decision brought no triumph, only clarity. The island would remain as it was, a home, not a commodity. When Harris returned later that day, he found Mark waiting. "You're making a mistake," Harris said, his tone sharper now, the practiced civility gone. "You could have had everything." Mark looked past him, toward the house where smoke rose steady from the chimney. Lucas was standing in the doorway with the dog. "I already do," he said simply. Harris watched him for a long moment, then turned and left without another word. The sound of the motor faded into the distance until only the wind remained. The days that followed were clear and bright. The snow vanished completely, revealing dark, rich soil. Wildflowers began to bloom along the path to the lake. Lucas helped plant a small garden near the porch, potatoes, carrots, beans. Storm chased butterflies and dug holes that ruined half their work, but neither father nor son minded. The house, once a burden, had become a heartbeat in their lives, steady and strong. On the last evening of spring, they built a fire near the shore. The air was still, the lake smooth as glass. They roasted fish over the flames, the skin crisping and curling under the heat. The smell of wood smoke clung to their clothes. Lucas leaned against his father, the dog stretched between them. Above, the stars came out one by one, reflected perfectly in the water below. Mark watched the glow of the fire fade into embers. In that moment, he understood what Severin had meant by a house that could endure any storm. It wasn't the walls or the roof. It was what they had rebuilt within themselves. Strength, patience, connection. The things that could bend and still remain whole. As night deepened, he looked back toward the house. Its windows glowed softly, the light flickering through the trees. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, curling into the quiet air. The lake lapped softly against the rocks, whispering in rhythm with the wind. Lucas yawned beside him, half asleep, and Mark placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Time to go in," he murmured. They walked back up the hill together, Storm trotting ahead. The house stood waiting, silent and steady, its walls still damp from rain but strong. When they stepped inside, warmth embraced them like an old friend. The fire crackled, and the smell of pine filled the air. Mark sat for a long time before the hearth after Lucas went to bed. The letters of Severin lay on the table, edges curled, the ink fading with age. He touched them lightly, as though acknowledging a conversation across time. Outside, the last of the ice on the lake broke apart, drifting quietly into open water. The wind pressed softly against the walls, not with force, but familiarity. He realized then that they were part of the same rhythm now, the house, the lake, the wind, and the people who listened to them. The storms would come again, as they always did, but they would not destroy what had been rebuilt. The island had taught them that survival was not resistance, but harmony. When Mark finally rose to close the shutters, he glanced once more at the fire. Its light reflected in the window, merging with the dark water outside, so that for a brief moment, it seemed as though the whole lake burned with quiet gold. Behind him, the dog shifted, sighing softly, and Lucas murmured in his sleep. The house exhaled in a long, creaking breath, as if alive. Mark smiled faintly. The world beyond might never know the story of Severin's Island, but it didn't need to. Some legacies were not meant to be spoken. They were meant to be lived. And as the wind moved through the trees and the lake whispered against the rocks, the house Severin's house, their house, breathed on, steady and unbroken, ready for whatever storms might come. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next one and share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too real to keep to yourself.